Snow blanketed ridge
someone down
falls
there.
in an eerie silence, muffling every sound except the crunch of boots and the soft exhale of breath from a German shepherd named Axel. Officer Mason Carter pulled his scarf higher over his mouth, his gloved hands buried in the pockets of his department-issued parka. The patrol was routine, too quiet. Winter nights in Ridge Falls usually were boring, frigid, and forgettable. But Axel stopped. Not a step, not a twitch. He simply froze on the riverbank, muscles locked, amber eyes fixed on the frozen surface of Ridge Creek. Mason slowed, puzzled. "Axel? What is it, boy?" The dog's ears were sharp, upright, alert to something unseen. His breath quickened. Then came the sound, a low, rising whine that turned into a haunting howl, cutting through the still night like a siren. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Urgency. Mason's boots hit the snow hard as he closed the distance. Axel hadn't moved. His gaze was glued to one spot in the ice, a narrow patch near the bend where the current slowed. Mason knelt beside him and peered down. At first he saw nothing. Then his breath caught. There, beneath the crystal-clear sheet of ice, floated a pale, small face. Eyes open, staring back. The face blinked. For a moment Mason forgot how to breathe. Then came the second shock. More movement, tiny hands thudding against the ice. Another face, then another. Dozens of them. Children. 30 at least. Still alive. "Jesus Christ," Mason whispered, backing up in disbelief. He fumbled for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Carter. I need immediate backup at Ridge Creek. Repeat, I need all available units. I've got eyes on the missing children. They're under the ice." "Alive." The radio hissed back static. Axel pawed at the surface, whimpering, as if begging someone to help. Mason dropped to the ground and brushed snow off the ice, pressing his face close. A girl's palm met his from the other side. Her skin was bluish, lips trembling. Her eyes locked with his, pleading. Mason yelled into the mic again. 30 kids, Ridge Creek, Frozen River. They're trapped but breathing. I don't know how. Just send everyone." In the silence that followed, Mason could hear faint thuds, a rhythmic knocking. Desperate, weak, but steady. Axel barked suddenly and lunged forward, his body slamming into Mason's chest. The dog growled low, not at the children, but at the water itself. Something was wrong. This wasn't just thin ice. This wasn't a tragic accident. Mason's eyes flicked to the far side of the creek. A shadow moved under the surface. A slow, drifting form, too large to be a child. It didn't move like a person. It hovered, watching. His blood ran cold. The first sirens echoed in the distance. Lights danced over the treetops as emergency crews began to arrive, tires crunching ice as they rushed into position. Mason flagged them down wildly. "Here. Start here. Cut the ice." Chainsaws roared, to life. Firemen dropped to their knees, punching into the frozen sheet as EMTs readied stretchers. Parents flooded in behind them, some screaming names, others simply falling to the ground in sobs. But the children weren't coming up. They weren't swimming to the holes. They were stuck. Mason turned to the fire chief, panic in his voice. "They're not surfacing. It's like something's holding them down." The chief frowned. "Hypothermia can do strange things." "No." Mason cut him off. "There's something down there." I saw it. A shape. Watching us, Axel barked again, spinning in circles before darting toward a quieter stretch of the river, just out of view from the others. He stopped at a narrow patch and began clawing at the ice like a wild animal. Mason hesitated. Standard protocol was to stay with the main unit. But Axel wasn't wrong. He had never been wrong in 6 years of partnership. Drug busts, search and rescue. tracking shooters through swamp. The dog had instincts no human could match. Mason followed. The snow thickened as they reached the bend. Axel pressed his nose to the ice and began to whimper, a soft, high-pitched cry that sounded almost human. Mason knelt beside him again. He heard it, faint knocking beneath the surface. But faster this time, urgent, desperate. He screamed for backup. "Over here." "There's more under this section." Another fire team broke off from the main crew and charged over with saws and thermal gear. As they carved through the ice, a sudden gust of wind swept across the river. Mason swore he felt the ground beneath him vibrate. Then the ice cracked. A long, jagged line raced across the river like lightning splitting the sky. Axel leapt back, barking furiously as the first hole gave way. A small hand reached through, clutching wildly. Mason grabbed it and pulled. A boy emerged, shivering violently, lips blue but breathing. A heartbeat later, another child surfaced through a second hole nearby. Screams erupted behind them, not of fear, but relief. But then silence. The third child didn't come. Axel began to growl again. Mason looked up. The shadow was back, nearer, shifting just beneath the fractured ice. He stared, heart pounding, unsure whether to believe his eyes. The shadow paused, then vanished, and just like that it was gone. But Mason knew this was no accident, no twist of fate. This was something else. And it wasn't finished. Ridge Falls was the kind of town where nothing ever really happened. Until it did. The kind of place where news traveled faster than emergency vehicles, and people still left their doors unlocked. But over the last 4 months, that quiet confidence had been chipped away, piece by piece, child by child. It began with a boy named Leo Abrams, 7 years old, vanished on his way home from school. Then it was a 10-year-old girl, Riley Stokes, taken right from her backyard while her father mowed the lawn. 2 more followed the week after. By the time local media caught on, 6 children were gone. No ransom notes, no evidence, no witnesses, just empty rooms and desperate parents. Mason Carter had worked those early cases. He remembered every name, every face, every time he knocked on a door and had to meet the eyes of another broken family. At first, the department threw everything they had at it: search teams, volunteers, drones, even psychic consultants. But as the disappearances climbed past 20, then 30, the state stepped in. The narrative began to shift. Whispers of coordinated runaways, mass hysteria. The FBI had briefly reviewed the files and pulled out again. And then, just like that, the urgency faded. The official word became colder. Lack of leads, investigations ongoing. Unofficially, they had given up. But Mason never did. He kept a small notebook in his locker. Inside, 30 names, 30 hand-drawn maps, each marked with where a child was last seen. Axel had been by his side for all of them, nose to the ground, tracking scents that seemed to vanish into thin air. For months, they found nothing but frozen silence. Until now. After the discovery at the river, Ridge Falls was no longer quiet. National news vans crowded the town square. Helicopters beat through the grey skies overhead. Officials swarmed in from every level of government, all scrambling for control. Mason barely had time to breathe. But amid the chaos, Axel changed. It started the day after the river incident. Mason had taken him for a walk along the edge of Ridge Creek, just like always. But Axel kept stopping, sniffing the air, then turning sharply as if being pulled by something unseen. Not a sound, not a scent, something deeper, almost like a memory being triggered. "You feel it too, don't you?" Mason murmured, watching the way Axel's ears twitched. Axel led him straight off the trail, toward a narrow path behind the trees. It was a route Mason had taken a dozen times before, but today the snow felt disturbed, flattened in places, as if someone or something had walked there recently. At the base of an old pine, Axel stopped and dug furiously. Mason crouched beside him. Under a few inches of packed snow, they found a piece of faded blue fabric, a child's glove. Mason's heart seized. The glove matched a pair worn by Jada Min, a Vietnamese-American girl who had disappeared 2 months earlier. It had been snowing hard that day. No one expected to find physical traces still out here. But Axel had. Mason called it in, but by the time the forensic team arrived, the snow was falling again, erasing everything. Later that night, Mason sat in the squad room alone, watching bodycam footage on repeat. Axel's behavior wasn't random. It was directional, intentional. He wasn't following a scent trail. He was following something else. The next day, Axel began acting more erratic. During morning patrol, he dragged Mason toward a drainage tunnel near Ridge Creek and refused to move until Mason followed. Inside, the air was frigid and damp. Mason's flashlight swept across the concrete walls, revealing scattered graffiti and muddy footprints. Then Axel stopped and stared at the wall. A fresh smear of red chalk arched across the surface, written by a child's hand. "Don't make a sound." Mason exhaled slowly, a chill crawling up his back. The phrase matched something strange they'd heard from one of the rescued children the night before. A little boy named Tanner had whispered it to his mother in the hospital, eyes wide with fear. "It said not to scream," he'd said. Mason hadn't understood it at the time. Now it sounded like a warning. The next afternoon, Axel refused to enter the department's K-9 unit training yard. Instead, he sat at the gate and growled, ears back. One of the new handlers, a brash rookie named Trent Lowe, laughed it off. "Guess your mutt's gone soft," he said, loud enough for the room to hear. Mason didn't flinch. He just looked at Axel. And Axel looked back, as if understanding the insult, then turned and walked to the far end of the lot, sat down, and refused to move until Mason followed. At the fence line, buried in a shallow drift, was another object. This time, a child's sketchbook, half frozen, pages warped from moisture. The top page showed crayon drawings, 30 stick figures standing in a line. Behind them, a black scribble with 2 red dots for eyes. Mason's hand trembled slightly as he closed the book. Something was guiding Axel. Not just scent, not coincidence. It felt like the dog was being pulled by the very memories of the children themselves. What they saw, where they had been, what they feared. That night, Mason couldn't sleep. He sat on his porch, Axel curled beside him, both watching the snowfall return. The street was quiet, the houses dim. Ridge Falls had returned to stillness, but now it was a different kind of silence, one that hid things, and somewhere beneath that silence, something was still watching, still waiting. Mason reached down, placing a hand gently on Axel's neck. "I need you, boy," he said softly. Axel's eyes flicked up, and in the distance, from the direction of Ridge Creek, came the faintest sound. A single knock. The shrill whine of approaching sirens cut through the silence like a blade. Lights stuttered through the trees, flashing red and blue against the snow-covered limbs as Ridge Falls transformed from quiet to chaos in a matter of minutes. By the time the first fire truck arrived at Ridge Creek, Mason was already pacing the edge of the ice, Axel at his side, his breath steaming, his eyes locked on the river like it might disappear at any moment. 30 kids, Mason shouted to the first responder leaping from the rig. "Under the ice." "They're alive." "What?" The man blinked, stunned. "Alive?" "2 of them made contact." "I saw them. They're moving. You got to cut now." The team didn't waste time. Chainsaws were offloaded, ice axes clanked against gear, and medics unfolded blankets and stretchers as more units poured in. Snowmobiles, police cruisers, and even a rescue helicopter circled above, spotlight sweeping the ice in sweeping arcs. The parents arrived next. The wails started low and built into a raw, collective scream as they saw the scene. Mothers dropped to their knees. Fathers ran forward, some slipping in the snow as they pounded on the ice with their fists. "Where's my son? My daughter's in there, I know it! Help them! Get them out!" Mason's throat burned as he tried to coordinate. His radio crackled non-stop. One firefighter slipped while clearing the first cut. Another shouted for ropes. The riverbank trembled under the weight of emotion and urgency. Axel barked once, sharp and commanding. He darted toward a narrow strip near the eastern bend, the same place he'd guided Mason the night before. Mason didn't hesitate. He called to the fire captain, a broad-shouldered veteran named Fields. "We need cutters over here. Follow the dog, Fields." Hesitated. "We're already punching through at the center. They're not surfacing. They're not coming up. Something's wrong." Fields looked at Axel, then at Mason, then cursed under his breath and waved 2 men to follow. They raced to the spot where Axel had stopped and began circling tight, nose low, body trembling. Mason knelt and pressed his ear to the ice. A sound. Dull, muffled, repeating, knocking. "Go in right here," Mason said, voice cold and steady. "Now." The saws screamed, ice cracked. As chunks began to lift, a collective breath seemed to hold across the scene. And then it happened. A hand shot up through the hole. Small, blue, trembling. A rescuer reached down, yanked hard, and pulled a boy into the air. He was shivering, barely conscious but breathing. Seconds later, another hole opened. A second child was lifted free. This one a girl, maybe 6, teeth chattering as a medic wrapped her in foil and blankets. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Mason stepped closer, trying to hear. She whispered something. "Don't let it hear me." "What?" he asked, crouching. The girl shook her head violently, then pressed her face into the medic's chest. Meanwhile, Field stood at the main cut site, frustrated. The rest of the children hadn't surfaced. No bubbles, no movement, nothing. "Why aren't they coming up?" One diver muttered, kneeling beside the hole. "It doesn't make sense." Another said, "They were right there. We saw them." Mason felt the answer before he spoke it. "They're not surfacing because they can't." The rescuers looked up. Mason met their eyes. "Something's keeping them down." "You mean the current?" Fields asked. "No, it's not water, it's not the river, it's something else." The words felt insane coming out of his mouth, but he believed them. He saw it in the dog's posture. Axel was pacing again, hackles raised, teeth showing, not toward anyone on the ice, but toward the water itself. "Look at him," Mason said quietly. Axel stopped and stared at the ice, unmoving. Then he growled, a deep, primal rumble Mason had only heard once before, in the woods on a manhunt when they'd found a body beneath leaves. This wasn't a warning growl. It was defiance. Mason walked to the edge, staring into the depths. The river beneath the cut was dark and restless. The spotlight from the helicopter flicked overhead, casting faint shadows in the ice. And then Mason saw it again. A shape. It was beneath the surface, gliding slowly, not with the randomness of a branch or debris, but with purpose. It paused, as if looking back at him. The water pulsed faintly around it. Mason staggered back. "There's something down there." Fields stared at him like he'd lost his mind. But then the little boy, the first rescued child, sat up suddenly on the medic's stretcher and screamed, "Don't let it back in the water!" His voice cracked like a whip across the riverbank. Everyone froze. Axel began barking wildly, running back and forth, pushing against the crowd. Mason lunged to steady him. "Easy, boy." "I see it too." The snow began falling harder again, coating the ground in a fresh layer, hiding prints, covering evidence. But nothing could hide the truth that now hung heavy in the air. This wasn't over. It had just begun. The search floodlights flickered through the trees as night tightened its grip on Ridge Falls. Rescue operations slowed, waiting on updated maps and sonar equipment from the state. Most of the media crews had pulled back to warm vans and satellite uplinks. The noise dulled, but the weight in the air didn't lift. Mason didn't stop. Neither did Axel. While the others regrouped, Mason followed the dog's lead. Axel had been restless since the last child was pulled from the ice. His usual focus had turned to agitation, ears twitching, body tense, tail rigid like a pointer's. He wasn't tracking scent anymore. He was being drawn. They veered away from the rescue site, trudging past floodlights and emergency tape into the tree line along the far bend of Ridge Creek. The snow here was thicker, untouched. The moon lit their path in shards between branches. Mason's boots cracked through thin crusts of ice, but Axel moved silently, a ghost in motion. "Where are you taking us?" Mason muttered, breath steaming. Axel didn't answer, but his pace quickened. He darted down a sloped embankment and stopped at a narrow inlet where the river curved sharply and slowed, an area not yet searched. Mason caught up and stepped alongside him. The water here looked different. The ice was smoother, thinner, stretched over the slowest part of the current. It had a glassy clarity that reflected the moonlight back in ghostly silver. Mason knelt, palm flat against the surface. And then he heard it. Knocking, not random, not ice shifting under stress. Rhythmic, deliberate, a signal. He leaned closer, ear nearly touching the ice. The sound came again, like a tiny heartbeat against glass. Tap, 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 tap. Someone was alive under here. "Hold on," he whispered. "We're coming." Axel whined low in his throat, and Mason turned. The dog wasn't looking at the ice anymore. He was staring through it. His body stiffened, hackles rising, teeth just barely exposed. Then came the sound, low and vibrating. A growl, but not one of warning, one of recognition. Axel stepped forward, placed a paw gently on the ice, and froze. His gaze didn't waver. Mason followed it, squinting through the faint ripples and fractures beneath the surface, and saw it. A shadow. It glided just under the frozen sheet, moving slow, deliberate, not flowing with the current. Too long for a child. Too smooth. It drifted past the knocked spot and paused directly beneath them. Mason couldn't move. Neither could Axel. The shadow shifted, turned slightly, as if looking up at them. There were no features, just shape. Human-like. Vaguely. Then it began to rise. Axel snapped. A sudden vicious bark tore from his chest as he lunged forward, paws crashing against the ice. Mason grabbed his harness, pulling him back. "Easy! Easy!" Axel twisted, snarling at the ice as if it were alive. Then the shadow stopped. Right beneath them. Mason's breath fogged the surface as he bent down again. The water underneath was perfectly still. And in that silence, something brushed the underside of the ice, soft but deliberate. A whisper through the ice. Mason staggered back. Axel kept barking, loud and raw. The shadow slid away slowly, melting into the dark like it had never been there. A long silence followed. Mason stood, staring at the spot. He dropped to one knee, pulled out his flashlight, and angled the beam under the ice. Nothing. No movement, no face, no hands. But the knocking had stopped. Axel sat, still shaking, eyes never leaving the ice. Mason radioed it in. "Unit 2-9, I've got movement beneath the ice on the east bend. Possible contact. Not human. Repeat. Not a child." The radio crackled. "Say again." "Just get someone down here." He clicked off, jaw clenched. They waited in the dark. For minutes, nothing moved. Then Mason whispered, "You saw it too, didn't you?" Axel didn't blink. The dog turned his head slowly and let out a low sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whimper. A sound Mason had never heard from him before. It sounded like warning, but it also sounded like fear. By sunrise, the river was locked under floodlights, cordoned off with yellow tape and armed patrols. Officials flooded in from every acronym imaginable, FBI, DHS, even a few suits from DC who never gave their names. But none of them were prepared for what Mason told them. "I saw something under the ice," he said firmly. "Not a log, not a body. It moved on its own. And it was watching us." The response was swift. Raised eyebrows, side glances, a whispered conversation near the command tent, and then the polite dismissal that came with forced concern. "You've been through a lot, Officer Carter," said Commander Hendricks, the federal rep with perfect hair and ice-blue eyes. "Extreme stress can do strange things to the mind." Mason didn't respond. He just stared past the man toward the bend in the river, where Axel still sat, quiet but alert. He knew what he saw, and so did Axel. A few hours later, Mason was called into the mobile command van. The drone team had reviewed thermal imaging and video footage from the Eastern Bend. Hendricks was there, along with the governor's liaison, a weather analyst, and a man in a dark suit who never introduced himself. They played the footage on loop. At first it showed only snow, broken branches, and a flash of Mason's own flashlight beam bouncing off the river. Then the camera angle shifted, just a second of drift as the drone pivoted over the frozen creek. And that's when they all saw it. A shape. It stood perfectly still beneath the ice. Upright. Humanoid. Shoulders squared. The figure wasn't fully defined, distorted by the thin veil of moving water and fractured light, but its outline was undeniable. Not a trick of shadows, not a pattern in the ice. It was standing. "Pause it," Mason said. The image froze. No one spoke. The man in the dark suit reached forward, rewound 5 seconds, then played it again at quarter speed. The figure moved slightly, a shift in posture, almost like it turned its head. Then it vanished. The drone had continued forward. Nothing remained in its wake. "Could be a reflection," the liaison muttered. "No reflection casts a shadow under ice." Mason replied, "And no shadow turns to look at a drone." But the conversation died there. Hendricks thanked everyone, dismissed the footage as inconclusive, and asked Mason to get some sleep. He didn't. Instead, he sat outside the tent with Axel, watching the sun disappear again behind thick clouds. That was when she arrived. Her SUV was old, unmarked. She didn't flash a badge when she stepped out, only nodded to Mason and offered her hand. "Agnes Holloway. You must be Carter." He shook her hand, wary. "You're with retired FBI, cold cases, behavioral science division. Officially, I'm not here." "Unofficially. I got a call about your report." "And I watched the drone footage." Mason raised an eyebrow. "And?" "I believe you." She said it without hesitation. Mason didn't know what to say. No one had believed him in days, not even his captain. Agnes sat beside him on the bench, zipped her coat tighter. "I saw the same thing 20 years ago. Barrow, Alaska. 23 kids vanished in 10 weeks. Every one of them last seen near a frozen inlet. No signs of struggle, just gone." Mason leaned in. "What happened?" "Search turned up nothing." Until one night, a K9 named Bishop went berserk near the edge of the ice. His handler followed and saw what you did, something humanoid under the surface. It didn't swim. It stood. And it watched. Did they pull the kids out? Agnes hesitated. "Only 3. Mason swallowed hard. "The rest were never found," she said. and every official who touched the case wrote it off as a cluster of unrelated disappearances. Said the dog reacted to a bear carcass under the ice. I filed a report. It disappeared before it ever made it into the system. She looked at him. You're not imagining things. Axel stirred beside them. His ears flicked, then he let out a soft chuff. Not a bark, but a kind of acknowledgement. Agnes reached down and ran a hand across his back. He knows. So did Bishop. Why now? Mason asked. Why here? Agnes stared out at the river. I don't think it's tied to a place. I think it follows trauma, grief. It waits. And then it takes. They sat in silence. The river glowed faintly under the last of the portable lights, a mirror to the sky above. Somewhere beneath, Mason knew, the children were still there, waiting, held by something that no one wanted to name. But now, at least, he wasn't alone. And neither was Axel. The hospital ward smelled like antiseptic and melted snow. The air was too warm, the lights too bright. But no one complained. The children who had been pulled from Ridge Creek lay in rows of beds, wrapped in heated blankets, IVs in their arms, silent as ghosts. Mason stood in the hallway, eyes locked on the one-way glass of the observation room. Axel sat at his heel, unusually still. They were watching the girl, Lena Dorsey, age 6, the second child pulled from the ice. She hadn't spoken since they brought her in. Until now. Inside the room, a nurse leaned down and whispered softly. Lena's lips moved. Her voice barely registered on the mic, but it was enough. It said not to scream. The nurse straightened slowly. A social worker stepped closer, gently asking, "Who said that, sweetheart?" Lena's eyes didn't blink. The man in the coat. The one with the gloves. What else did he say? Lena's small hands fidgeted in her lap. Nothing. He just pointed to where. Lena lifted a trembling finger and pointed to the floor. Mason turned away from the glass. In the room beside Lena's, another boy, Marcus Hill, age 9, told the same story. So did a third child, a girl named Naomi, who hadn't spoken at all until she whispered the same line. It said not to scream. Every child described the same figure. Tall, wearing a winter coat, face covered, silent. He never dragged them, never forced. He only gestured, always with one finger to his lips. And they followed. Why? Because they thought it was a game. Hide and seek. Marcus said, "He told us it was a secret game." "Did you want to play?" The therapist asked gently. "He made us want to," the boy said. "I don't know how." Mason felt a chill crawl up his spine. None of the kids had used the word kidnap. Not one described feeling fear when they first saw him. It wasn't until they were under the ice, until the darkness and the silence pressed in, that something shifted. But even then, none of them screamed. They remembered only the pressure, the silence, the weight. Agnes stood beside Mason, arms folded tightly, her eyes locked on the observation screens. "This isn't a kidnapping," she said quietly. Mason nodded. "Then what is it?" She exhaled slowly. "Something older. Deeper. It's not just physical, it's psychological. The way these kids describe it, it's almost ritualistic. Like they were primed for it. By who? Not who," she corrected. By what? Mason glanced down at Axel, who hadn't moved since they entered the ward. His ears were upright, but he wasn't scanning the room. He was focused on the children, watching each one as if trying to recognize something they couldn't name themselves. "They all say the same thing," Mason said. "Same coat. Same silence. Same gesture. It's a form of induced compliance," Agnes said. "But not from fear. From something else. Maybe something they can't even describe." Mason looked through the glass again. What makes them follow someone under the ice without screaming? Agnes hesitated. Something that doesn't feel like a stranger. That landed like a stone in Mason's chest. Later that night, he sat outside the hospital on a bench dusted with snow, Axel leaning into his side for warmth. The traffic had died down, the press moved to the next headline, but the children remained inside, cocooned in heat and silence. He remembered Lena's voice again. It said not to scream. That wasn't just a memory, it was an instruction, and they'd followed it. You think they're still under its spell? Mason asked. Agnes stood behind him, steaming coffee in hand. I think whatever this is, it doesn't leave when the children do. Axel shifted suddenly, nose in the air. Then came the sound. Soft, faint. From somewhere across the parking lot. 3 slow knocks, deliberate. Spaced. Mason stood instantly, heart slamming in his chest. Agnes dropped her cup. Axel bolted forward into the darkness, barking once, then vanishing into the trees. Mason ran after him without a word. Something was still out there. Watching. Waiting. The moment Axel broke from his heel, Mason knew something had changed. They were halfway through briefing the state task force near the Ridge Falls command post when Axel's head snapped up. His ears twitched, nose in the air, body tense like a coiled spring. Without warning, he let out a single bark, short, sharp, electric, then bolted into the tree line. "Axel!" Mason shouted. But the dog was already gone. No hesitation. No confusion. Just purpose. Mason didn't wait for permission. He grabbed his coat and sprinted after him. Behind him, Agnes didn't ask questions. She followed. They ran through thigh-deep snow, dodging branches and drifts, boots slipping on hidden roots. The cold bit into their lungs, but neither of them slowed. They trusted the dog more than they trusted any of the men back at the site. Axel didn't waver. He moved with precision, weaving through the forest as if he'd already memorized the route. Mason had no idea how far they'd gone until the lights of Ridge Falls disappeared completely behind them. The sky above was overcast, the woods growing darker by the second. 2 miles in, then 3. The trees thinned abruptly, opening into a narrow clearing. There, in the center, sat a cabin. Old, sagging, forgotten. Its roof was partially collapsed on one side. The windows were boarded. Snow had swallowed the porch steps. It didn't look like it had been touched in years. But Axel stood at the door, paws on the threshold, tail stiff, teeth bared in silence. Mason caught up, panting, pulling his flashlight from his belt. "What is this place?" Agnes stepped beside him, eyes narrowing. This wasn't on the search maps. The door creaked as Mason pushed it open. Inside, the air was still, heavy with mildew and dust. Cobwebs hung like curtains from the rafters. The wood creaked under their feet as they stepped inside, Axel leading the way with precise, silent steps. "Jesus," Mason whispered. The walls were covered, scratched into the timber, drawn in faded charcoal, written on torn notebook pages pinned with rusted nails, symbols, words, maps. Agnes walked slowly along one wall, tracing the surface with gloved fingers. "Look at this." She pointed to a series of carved lines, a map of Ridge Falls, clearly hand-drawn, rivers, streets, schools, the town square. At least a dozen red dots were etched into the wood. Mason leaned in. "Those are the locations of the abductions." Each dot matched a case. Above the map, in large, shaky letters, someone had carved, "Keep them quiet." On the adjacent wall, dozens of sticky notes were tacked in uneven rows. Most were too water-damaged to read, but a few were legible. "No more screams, they're too loud, the sound wakes it, the eyes in the water." Axel let out a low whine. He moved to the far corner of the cabin, nose twitching, pawing at a loose floorboard. Mason crossed the room and knelt, prying it up. Beneath, wrapped in a plastic sheet, was a metal lockbox. He cracked it open. Inside, newspaper clippings, most of them brittle, dated decades apart. Each story told of missing children, different towns, different years, all near frozen rivers or lakes. None were ever solved. Agnes knelt beside him. "These are from all over the country." She pulled one clipping free, Barrow, Alaska, 2002. Her hands trembled. "I was there," she whispered. Mason scanned another article. Montana, 1987. 21 children vanished over a winter break. Same pattern, same phrases. "Someone's been tracking this for years," he said. "Longer. And now it's here," Agnes said quietly. Axel growled deep in his chest. He turned toward the only remaining door inside the cabin, a closet in the back, chained shut with rusted links. The air around it was colder than the rest of the room. Mason's flashlight flicked slightly, a stutter of light across peeling wallpaper. Axel barked once, sharply. Mason approached the door, unhooked the chain with a metallic snap, and pulled it open. Inside, the closet was empty, except for one thing. On the back wall, someone had scrawled a final message, smeared in charcoal and something darker: "It never left, it never will." Axel stared into the dark space, unmoving, as if listening. Then his head turned sharply toward the window. Mason followed his gaze. Far beyond the tree line, the wind had picked up. Snow swirled violently against the dark, but deep in the white, something was moving. Slow. Watching. He didn't speak. Neither did Agnes. Axel let out a sound Mason had never heard from him before. It wasn't a bark. It wasn't a growl. It was something closer to a warning. A signal. The game wasn't over. It had never been. The ice was thinning. 2 days of unseasonal warmth had turned Ridge Creek from a white, frozen shell into a dangerous latticework of cracks and slush. What had once held secrets now threatened to swallow them whole. The children still trapped beneath, those who hadn't yet been found, were weakening. The hospital reported signs of hypothermia in the latest 2 rescued. They spoke slower now, moved less. And then, they stopped talking altogether. Axel hadn't rested since they left the cabin. He paced along the banks, pausing at intervals, nose pressed to the ground, turning toward the water with a deep, steady growl that vibrated from his chest. Every time he stopped, Mason marked the spot on his GPS. None of them aligned with the official rescue sites. Mason pushed through the flap of the command tent, face tight with urgency. "They're in the wrong place," he said. "They're searching where it's convenient, not where it matters." Commander Hendricks didn't look up from his tablet. "You don't have authority to redirect units, officer." "With respect, sir, I'm not asking permission." "You're chasing ghosts." "I'm following a trained K-9 who's found every viable lead we've had." "You're acting emotionally." Mason leaned forward. "Kids are dying under that ice. You want to wait for it to melt and float their bodies to shore?" The tent fell silent, but Hendricks didn't move. Outside, a group of townspeople had gathered near the barricades, holding signs, chanting, "Stop the fear machine, no more panic. Let the kids come home." Fueled by a local podcast conspiracy, they believed the entire crisis was staged. Some thought it was government testing. Others claimed the children were part of an underground adoption ring and that Mason and the team were covering it up. One man even accused Axel of being a military tracking prototype. Mason stepped out into the noise. The protesters jeered as he passed, filming with their phones. But he didn't stop. He walked straight to the back lot where Agnes stood beside a snowcat loaded with thermal drills, sonar equipment, and a generator. "You sure you want to do this?" she asked. "No." Mason replied. "But I'm not leaving them down there." Axel barked once, sharply, already leaping onto the back of the snowcat. A few minutes later, they were on the ice. Mason, Agnes, Axel, and 4 rescue techs who had volunteered against orders. All trusted Axel more than politics. The dog moved deliberately. He sniffed, then stepped, pausing, circling, barking, once, twice, then sitting down, staring into the ice with steady, unblinking eyes. "This is it," Mason said. "Drill here." No one hesitated. The team fired up the drill. It roared to life, sending steam and ice shavings into the air. The bit chewed through the thick surface faster than expected, exposing water that churned black and cold beneath. Mason dropped a thermal sensor into the hole. The screen lit up. Dozens of flickering heat signatures clustered just beneath the surface. Some strong, others fading. "They're right under us," he whispered. Agnes stared at the monitor. "Why aren't they trying to surface?" Mason didn't answer, because he already knew. Axel stood still, not barking, not growling, listening. Then he turned suddenly, facing the far end of the creek. His ears perked. Mason followed his line of sight. And there, just beyond the range of the floodlights, the surface of the ice shimmered strangely. Not cracked, not melting, but bending inward as if something heavy moved beneath it. Axel snarled, loud and guttural. The rescuers paused. "What is that?" one of them whispered. The water pulsed. A black shape rose, just for a moment, pressing against the ice like a bruise. Then it slid back down. The screen on the thermal monitor flickered, and then the heat signatures began to move. Not up, but away, as if being dragged. "No," Mason muttered. "They're pulling them again." "Who?" one tech asked. Mason pointed to the spot Axel had marked. "Cut a second hole." Now the drill spun again. Faster, axes came out. Mason dropped to his knees, punching through the slush with bare hands. He broke the ice himself, shoving pieces aside until water surged up and flooded over the surface. Then, from the darkness below, a small hand reached up. He grabbed it. The girl was barely conscious, her lips blue, but she was breathing. Axel barked once, short, sharp, then spun around, dashing down the ice, barking as he ran. He stopped, turned back, and barked again, louder, more urgent. "He's found another," Mason shouted. "Go!" The team followed. The protesters at the shore had fallen silent, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. The drills screamed, holes opened, more hands emerged. 4 children, then 5, then 6. They pulled until they had no strength left. Then, from beneath the last hole, nothing. Just still water. Axel sat beside it, eyes fixed on the ice. Waiting. The shadow didn't come back that night, but the ice kept melting, and the race wasn't over yet. The air was colder by the water that night, not because of temperature, but because of presence. Something had shifted. The final cluster of children rescued earlier that afternoon were stable, but unconscious. Their vitals had dropped without warning. Doctors couldn't explain why. There were no infections, no signs of trauma, just stillness, as if something had followed them out. Axel hadn't stopped pacing since sundown. He walked the perimeter of the creek like a sentry, ears tuned to sounds no one else could hear. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just moved, slow, focused, locked in. Mason and Agnes followed him without a word. They were half a mile upstream when Axel stopped, nose to the ground. Then he lifted his head and gave one low, throaty bark. Mason flicked off his flashlight. The moonlight barely reached this far. They heard the sound before they saw anything. Crunch. Footsteps. Measured. Heavy. Then a figure emerged from the tree line. He wore a full-body dry suit, slick with river water, the kind worn by divers in Arctic conditions. No markings, no logos, just black neoprene and thick rubber boots. A heavy mask covered his face, fogged over. A red light blinked from the collar, some kind of breathing regulator. He didn't speak. Didn't stop walking either. Mason raised his voice. "Stop right there." Ridgefall's PD. The figure paused, then slowly turned his head. There were no weapons, no threats, just stillness. "Take off the mask," Mason said, stepping forward. Axel growled, deep and low. The man did nothing. Then Agnes stepped around Mason, flashlight steady, and squinted at the figure's posture, his gait, his hands, the stillness in his shoulders. Her breath caught. "I know him," she whispered. Mason glanced back. "Are you sure?" Agnes nodded once. "His name is Wallace Kern. He was a suspect in a missing children case in Alaska. 20 years ago." I worked the scene. Mason stared at the figure. He was cleared. Agnes clenched her jaw. "Not exactly." The case fell apart. No evidence, no bodies, no one wanted to press charges without something physical. The man took another slow step forward. Mason raised his hand again. "You need to stay right where you are." Finally, the man lifted a hand to the mask and unlatched it. The hiss of released pressure was sharp in the cold air. When the mask came off, the face beneath was empty, emotionless, eyes that didn't blink, skin pale, hair thinning, mouth flat like someone who had forgotten how to smile, or never knew how. His voice, when it came, was like frost scraping across steel. "They scream too much." Agnes stepped forward. "Why the river?" He blinked, slow. "The cold quiets them." "You took them." "I didn't hurt them." Agnes' voice turned ice. "You kept them." He nodded, like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. "They were loud. Up there. Noisy. Always crying. But when the water covers them, they stop. Peaceful. Like snow. You knew they were alive. They weren't screaming anymore. That's how I knew it was working." Mason's blood ran hot. "You buried children in ice to make the world quieter?" Wallace tilted his head. "They weren't mine to hurt." "Just mine to quiet." Axel lunged forward, teeth bared, only restrained by Mason's grip. "You don't get to decide who's loud," Mason said through clenched teeth. "You don't get to decide who stays silent." "I don't decide. It does what does." Wallace blinked. "The thing under the ice." It came first. I only helped. Mason stared, unable to move. "You're saying there's something else down there?" Wallace smiled faintly for the first time. "I never go deep. I just carry them close enough." "It does the rest," Agnes whispered. "You're not insane." He looked at her. "You're complicit." He didn't flinch. "We all hear it eventually. If you stay near long enough." Suddenly, Axel snapped. His body surged forward, forcing Mason off balance. The leash tore from his glove, and the dog bolted at Wallace, who made no attempt to flee. But Axel didn't bite. He circled the man once, then sat right in front of him, eyes locked upward, steady and unblinking. Mason froze. "What's he doing?" Agnes swallowed. "He's identifying him. Cataloguing. Like he's not done yet." Wallace tilted his head down and stared into Axel's eyes. For the first time, something changed in that cold, detached face. Fear. Real, raw fear. He took a step back. Axel stood. Another growl rumbled low in his throat. Then came a sound. A knock. 1, 2, 3. From the river, behind them. Wallace turned and ran. Axel exploded after him, Mason close behind. But when they reached the water's edge, Wallace was gone. No footprints, no splash, just melting ice, and a mask floating on the surface, turning slowly. Still fogged, still warm, still breathing. Dawn broke over ridge falls, quiet and pink, like the town had forgotten to breathe overnight. Snow clung to the trees in hushes of white. The ice on the river cracked faintly beneath the warming sky. But all the shouting, all the chaos, all the fear was gone. So were the children, all 30, rescued, not in one sweep, not in one dramatic moment, but slowly, with grit, muscle, fire-heated drills, and the unrelenting instinct of a German shepherd who simply would not give up. Axel had led them to every final child. Each bark had marked a spot where life was still holding on beneath the dark. Each circle he paced had meant, here, dig here, don't wait. And that last time, when the final cluster was fading, he barked just once, then sat. Mason had never seen his partner so still. Not after a track, not after a chase, not even after that long flood rescue in Louisiana, when Axel had nearly drowned saving a man's daughter. But this time, Axel simply curled up on the riverbank, paws tucked beneath him, head resting between them, and eyes watching the water with something close to peace. Mason dropped to the snow beside him. "You did it," he said quietly, brushing snow from the dog's thick coat. Axel didn't move, but his ears twitched. "You saw what no one else dared to see." Behind them, the town slowly gathered. News crews arrived late. The protesters, once loud and angry, stood in silence, signs forgotten in the frost. Mothers wept openly. Fathers gripped strangers' shoulders in disbelief. Agnes stood to the side, staring out across the thawing river. The authorities would never publicly confirm what had happened. Wallace Kern had vanished, listed only as a person of interest. No charges, no trial, no admission of the darkness that still stirred beneath the surface. But the children were alive, and Axel had brought them back. When the final ambulance drove off, Mason stayed. He stayed until the sky turned pale blue and the sun lifted over the hills. He stayed as Agnes knelt beside him, placing a hand gently on Axel's shoulder. "He's earned rest," she said. Mason nodded. The dog's breathing was steady, slow, not sick, not injured, just tired in the way only someone who gave everything could be. "He'll be okay?" Mason asked, though he wasn't sure who he was asking. Agnes nodded. "Yeah, but he won't be the same." Mason looked out over the creek one last time. Neither would he. The people of Ridge Falls would return to their routines. The snow would melt. The headlines would fade. But in a quiet room somewhere, a child would suddenly sit up and whisper, "It told me not to scream." And Mason would remember. Remember the cold, the silence, and the dog who broke it. As they rose to leave, Axel lifted his head, gave one last glance at the water, and pressed his nose into Mason's hand. Then he closed his eyes and slept. Mason smiled through the ache in his chest. "What about you?" he asked softly, eyes to the trees. "What's your story with a loyal pet?" Because sometimes the only thing standing between the dark and the lost is 4 legs, 2 eyes, and 1 voice that refuses to stop barking. If this story moved you, share it. Support the heroes with paws. Subscribe to our channel where every bark echoes a story worth telling. This one was Axel's. Who will be next? You're watching German Shepherd Stories. Thanks for staying with us.